Today we're going to talk about game emulation.
Game begin.
Nintendo doesn't like you. In fact, Nintendo
There's a gaming company out there
despises
that
you, as
hates
far as I've
its
gathered
user
in the
base
last
biggest
several
more than
years.
Nintendo.
With emulation.
I can tell they
is
just
the
don't want people
legality.
emulating their games,
It's
which
like
I
they're
understand.
speed
But
running.
please,
Nintendo
if
is
you
showing
want
companies
people to
how
stop
hated that they are
emulating
ruthless
Switch,
and overall
update the
don't care about their
Switch. There are
fans
phones now
because
more
you and I will
powerful
continue
than
to
that
buy their
console.
stuff and they will continue to make billions.
Game emulators have been around for years. They've been an amazing way to play old games that otherwise might have been lost, hard to find, or just plain inaccessible. And it's gotten one company big bad in particular. More on that in a minute. I've been working on this concept for this video for about 3 years now, and every time I thought I was done writing it, some new dramatic developments would happen. It went from, wow, emulators are awesome, to, wow, there's a war brewing. So about 3 years ago, my wife sent me a video about a little handheld emulator from a channel called RetroDodo. It sparked in me this miniature obsession with handheld emulators that I haven't quite shaken yet. And for a quick $40, I was reliving my Game Boy Advance SP years all over again. No, it doesn't have the same original build quality as the original SP, but to the discerning eye, you'll see that it has a few more features. It has extra buttons, a Type-C charging port, as well as an SD card slot for loading up all your games. And as for your games, it can play quite the catalog of systems, all the way up to a PlayStation, which is extra trippy seeing it on a little clamshell design. It's like two streams of nostalgia colliding. And just like a potato chip, I couldn't have just one. Next, I picked up the RK2020. It carries much more power, a much more vibrant screen, and a more traditional horizontal Game Boy style Advance layout. Which was all fun and games until I dropped it 2 feet off the ground and it never turned on again. Now that quality was on the checklist, I found the Retroid Pocket 2. And just look at this thing. I smile every time I look at it. This little system is the most customizable of the bunch, being built on the back of Android. You can really tweak your experience, either by running its custom Retroid boot or running the emulators of your choice off of the Google Play Store. And importantly, it's much better built.
I'm built different.
Now, I use these emulators mostly to play Game Boy Advance and PlayStation games from the good old days when my life was a lot simpler. A little nostalgic dopamine kick, if you will. So, back to why Nintendo hates you. Well, it's a dark road that I sadly had to travel down. Emulators' legality is kind of complicated. Back in the year 1990, Nintendo took a company named Galoopt to court over the distribution of the Game Genie. Those were little customized game cartridges that had cheat codes for Nintendo games. Nintendo claimed that the system hurt their sales and was in violation of their intellectual property. But the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the company, saying that it fell under fair use and that the software was its own unique build and they had the right to distribute it. They also awarded Galoob $15 million over the lost sales in the Game Genie since Nintendo had issued some court order to make them stop selling it. And that was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out battle. In the late 1990s, Connectix made a software called the Virtual Game System, or VGS, that let people play PlayStation games on Mac computers. To do this, they reverse engineered Sony's PlayStation BIOS. Sony wasn't happy about it and sued Connectix over copyright and trademark infringement. At first, the court sided with Sony and stopped Connectix from selling VGS. Connectix appealed, and the higher court ruled in their favor, saying that reverse engineering the BIOS was fair use. Keyword to note in this whole conversation. And they said it didn't hurt Sony's trademark, and this case was set an important precedent for reverse engineering software development for emulation purposes. In the end, Sony bought the rights to VGS and essentially stopped selling it. They They snuffed it out of existence. But the legal impact of the case still stands. This set the precedent on the government's attitude towards emulators. I mean, they knew what it was being used for. Its sole purpose was to play games, copywritten games. Allowing it to exist, but not to use it would be really weird. Like, yeah, you can have a car, but you better not put any gas in it. In fact, during the 2020 lockdown, Rikers Island, the prison, the scary big prison, bought 5,500 handheld emulators for their prisoners using taxpayer dollars. And these emulators came preloaded with a bunch of game ROMs that were not exactly sanctioned by the original copyright holders. So I guess if Uncle Sam does it, it's okay. Copyright law and illegal distribution of media at first seems pretty straightforward. If you go to the store and see Mario Kart 8 on the shelf but refuse to pay the $60 to obtain it and go home and download it instead, well, that's straight up piracy 101. But say you want to buy a copy of Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town for the Game Boy Advance. Well, that game hasn't been on a store shelf in almost 20 years. I cannot give Nintendo any money for that game anymore. It's impossible. It's not available to buy anywhere except maybe like eBay or some used game store or something. And in those cases, that money isn't going to the developers or publishers either. It's just going to whoever held it last. That's another issue. Because of the scarcity of a lot of these older games, people are scalping the prices for egregious amounts. I paid $40 for this copy of Harvest Moon when it sold for $30 brand new back in the day. Some might say I even got a deal on it because some of the other games for my childhood have gone up like 10 to 20 times the price. And there's another issue that's becoming more and more of a problem. These cartridges don't live forever. Linus Tech Tips did a video not long ago about how a lot of these cartridges are decaying over time. And they have a limited amount of times that you can use a cartridge before the contact points wear off. Also, the RAM or tiny batteries like the CMOS batteries eventually just start eroding and dying, and eventually the contents of the cartridges can be lost forever. Meaning, your copy of Lemony Snicket's Series of Unfortunate Events on the Game Boy Advance will soon be gone forever. And let's face it, weird, obscure games like that are never going to be brought back, unlike the vastly more popular titles like Donkey Kong Country.
Shower you with coconut cream pies.
And to be fair, the companies like PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox are making at least some efforts in bringing back some of the classic titles to be played on their newer systems. I mean, who thought today that I would be able to play Blinks on Xbox again? The problem is that they're only bringing back some of the bigger hits, which is understandable, but there's a massive library of great titles that will just never be given the same treatment. The first game I ever bought on my Game Boy Advance was Lemony Snicket's Series of Unfortunate Events. It was a weird game. There was probably only like 5 kids who played it, but to me, it was a lot of fun. And I have a lot of memories attached to it. But the only way I can play it now, in most cases, is with an emulator. Video games are much more culturally interwoven into our society now than they used to be. I mean, think about it. You can now have 3 generations of people who grew up with gaming that all have experiences and fond memories of gaming. The gaming industry rakes in more money than the film and music industry combined now, which is wild to think about. And I think it's important to preserve that history as much as we can. Which brings up the practice of cartridge dumping. Now that's how we get these ROMs to begin with. Cartridge dumping devices allow you to dump the contents of your cartridges into a digital ROM. So you can basically make a digital backup of your retro gaming library. And that's what most consider to be the most ethical way of game emulation. I mean, if you own the game and you're only making a digital backup of it, it makes sense. Especially if eventually these hunks of plastic and silica are going to deteriorate into the void at some point. You can even do this with modern games that you run on different hardware. Say you go through with that purchase of Mario Kart 8, but you want to be able to play it in glorious 4K on that overly expensive beefcake computer. You should be able to, right? Well, not according to Nintendo. Nintendo on multiple occasions has attacked various YouTube creators that legally own copies of Nintendo games, but decided to emulate them for a better experience, or simply because they had to be able to play online with different people in different parts of the world. One recent example was the Super Smash Bros. Melee tournament held by Big House. They had always run this tournament in person, but in 2020 there was a very compelling reason not to. You know. So they decided to hold it online this year instead. But since the version they were playing was Melee for the GameCube, it had to be done through an emulator and a mod so that they could play online, because it was never meant to do that. Nintendo promptly sent them a cease and desist letter to cancel that event because they were emulating it. Their argument was that this was never the intended way to play the game, and that they were violating the user agreement, which is a wild argument. It's like Kellogg's coming over to burn down your house because you poured the milk first before your Fruit Loops.
FBI, open up!
Okay, maybe that's not the best argument. I think most people would side with Kellogg's on that one. It just seems like such an aggressive stance to take on a game that you don't even sell anymore. You might make the argument that they were well within their rights to defend their intellectual properties, but it seems like such a poor move to attack a community that loves you more than you deserve. Like, think about it. People are still playing a game that you made 20 years ago. They like it so much that they've made a career off of broadcasting it and playing it to tons of other people. And these players also no doubt had original copies of that game, since they originally used it to play in these tournaments with original copies of the game on Nintendo GameCubes. And if you think for a minute, even for modern games, with the state that Nintendo has been releasing some of these game titles, barely being able to play them at like 15 frames a second after paying $60, the argument that you're not playing the way you were intended to play is a pretty stupid stance to take. It's like the Nintendo PowerPoint presentation. But this is where it gets even weirder. Nintendo has directly benefited from people using emulators, despite how much they hate them. Yes, that's right. You either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. A Super Mario 3D All-Stars limited release was speculated to be using ROMs instead of just a ported code. There were a lot of reasons for that, like funky code that's usually only seen in emulation layers used by emulators, ROMs that could be obtained from pirate sites. I mean, I guess it's not really stolen if it was yours to begin with, but that would actually mean that they just downloaded a ROM of each game and slapped it in the cartridge and charged us $60. Oh, by the way, if you missed buying it, it's no longer for sale. They were only selling it for a limited time to generate scarcity or whatever to make people buy it. So if you want to play Super Mario Sunshine again, get wrecked. You missed your chance. But it goes even deeper. Nintendo has figured out that just by monitoring these ROM download sites, they can figure out which games people actually care about and have them made in re-releases to sell again. This year, in 2023, there have been more re-releases from Nintendo than actual new games, or like, at least feels that way. And there's one that especially surprised me, and that is from my favorite childhood game, the Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection. I never thought that this series would see the light of day again. It had a really cool world and story along with a criminally overlooked multiplayer system. I mean, it was for the Game Boy Advance, and the multiplayer on that was darn near impossible unless you and your friend had the same exact game and you both had that stupid little link cable to link your consoles together. Anyone I knew that grew up playing the game still loves it to this day. But no one really knew how amazing the multiplayer was until people started emulating it and hacking the multiplayer ability to work over Wi-Fi. And because of that, the community has grown and even more tournaments have been held, especially by one group in particular called the N1 Grand Prix, which is a reference to the tournament inside the game itself. Nintendo and Capcom realized this and decided it was time for yet another re-release, which, of course, I bought. But I bought it on Steam. I didn't support Nintendo, which I think is the biggest takeaway from this. Nintendo doesn't seem to realize that people are still willing to pay for their games if only they would make them available. They make no money at all from the used market, so why can't they sell downloadable versions of their old obscure games on the virtual consoles? The virtual consoles are a great step in the right direction, but they're also incredibly limited as far as their library is concerned. And this doesn't have to be the case. The entire Game Boy Advance library is only like 3 gigabytes. On their legal page of the website, they have a whole section on this and say that legitimizing the use of ROMs makes no financial sense, and saying that if they made them available, they would be supporting piracy, which is stupid. It's seriously brain dead. You don't have to make them free. You can just sell them or stream them or whatever. People wouldn't be downloading them illegally if you made them available to purchase or at least subscribe to. Okay, maybe some would, but people wouldn't have to. So summing all that up, they say that no, you can't make copies of your own game that you purchased, and that doing that is still illegal. It's real tough if you have any nostalgia attached to these at all. They're saying if we want you to enjoy these characters and games again, it will be when we say you can. For the whole making a copy of your own physical game, that portion being illegal, I don't really think that would survive in court. If it was provable that you only made a copy for yourself and did not distribute it, I really don't think any courtroom would side with them. But pretty much all they say there is mostly true. If they do own the copyrights to these games, and if they say that you cannot emulate them, then they're within their legal right to say that. Heck, if it was in their EULA that you had to do the hokey pokey every time you turned on your GameCube, you would be legally bound to do that if you wanted to play Super Mario Strikers. This all comes down to lawful evil. They have like this disdain for their fan base and refuse to make proper solutions for the issues at hand. Yes, piracy is bad, but find a solution other than spending millions of dollars trying to fight it. Again, these are all on games that they don't even sell anymore, and they're not even losing a market on. They could just stream these games or add them to the virtual consoles or something like that instead, and actually make some money and appease their fans. What's left of them. But no, they chose violence instead. And I think the real reason is made pretty obvious in their frequently asked section about their intellectual properties. You see, Nintendo needs scarcity to farm your nostalgia. If you want to play Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, you're going to have to wait for its third release whenever that inevitably is going to drop. Because though it's a fan favorite, you can't play it right now according to Nintendo. It was available on the Wii U shop, but now that's gone. It could be dumped on the Nintendo Switch shop, but nope. They need to wait a little while longer for your desperate needs to come to an irresistible point. You know, so that you'll pay 60 clams for it willingly. My guess is that they're going to release it again at the end of the Nintendo Switch cycle, or maybe as a launch title for whatever the next thing is. But again, when it comes to those obscure titles that you may have a connection with, well, they're going to be gone for good soon. And Nintendo doesn't care. Which is a real shame because the film industry isn't treated in the same way. Tons of old films are archived and protected to preserve history. Pretty much any song that's ever been recorded is available to legally stream whenever you want. Streaming has become the standard for consuming media, or at least the ability to download it from the legal right holders. Even PC games mostly get the same treatment, with massive archives like the Steam library. Well, there's another argument to be made for fair use. Fair use is a large legal gray area. Some precedents have been set for what can be accepted as fair use, but ultimately most would have to be solved by a case-by-case instance that are defensible on both sides of the dispute. For example, a widely accepted practice of fair use is by using copyrighted media in the use of a review or commentary form. or if you made digital backups of CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays you purchased legally, or even made hard copies of digital media, in almost all cases you're good to go so long as you're not distributing those copies. Even if Nintendo said you can. One thing to remember though is that the argument of fair use is just an argument until settled in court. Though it needs to be said that a lot of these cases have already been solved, and if it's a widely practiced thing that is proven acceptable at this point, then those battles have mostly been fought already. It also varies on the jurisdiction that you're under. The thing to consider in any fair use case is the factors they use to determine if something truly is fair use or not. The key factors being, is the use of copyright interest in a transformative, or is it adding or altering it in some sort of significant way? Some might make the argument that playing Super Mario Sunshine in 4K resolution with added shaders is transformative, because it was never built to be played in that way to begin with. Or altered or modded copies of the game could be considered transformed, maybe? I'm not a lawyer, don't... And these companies don't just fight you for fun, they're trying to defend their precious money. I get it, it's a business. But if copies of a game are no longer for sale, and there's no intention to sell these games again, of what impact are you imposing? The argument, of course, was mentioned earlier for nostalgia mining. Potential markets have already been defended before when making the argument that these copyrighted products are not available for sale, that the potential for selling them was being stripped away. And just because a company doesn't want to sell you something, it doesn't make you entitled to take it. I'm definitely not legally qualified to tell you what to do, except really dive into the ethics of fair use and come to your own conclusions or seek appropriate legal advice. At this point, Nintendo probably already has struck this video, so I better wrap things up. All in all, I think Nintendo makes some great stuff. But despite trying to come off as all warm and fuzzy, they really are just a money-shoveling corporation that do not care about you. I think the problems that they're facing with emulation could easily be fixed for them, but they just don't have it in them to change. Despite what would clearly put them in the goodwill of their customers. When video streaming first started, it decimated piracy, and it made it easier and more accessible to watch shows and movies. Nintendo has been tiptoeing in that direction, but only with the most obvious of IPs. Since the beginning of writing this script for this video until now, news stories of Nintendo attacking emulation have piled higher and higher to the point that is way beyond what is reasonable. Just look at the story of Gary Bowser getting not only jail time for selling hacked Switches, but ordered to pay a soul-crushing 20% of his income for the rest of his life. Now, the things that he did were illegal if you look it up. They weren't good. But he wasn't the sole person responsible for it. And to basically have like a life-ending sentence like that is very beyond what is, like, reasonable. And Nintendo just... It's a pretty brutal story. Check it out. I'm sure there's already a lot of opinions on this topic, and there is. I've already said a lot of things, so feel free to keep it civil and add your 2 cents in the comments. This is intended to be a conversation, and it's a conversation I've been seeing a lot more of lately. You like the hat? Well, it's a limited time drop, so get yours in the link below. And with that, I'm out of here.